I mean, we don't say that a lion has to be sent to the gas chamber if it kills a gazelle, let's say. It's a step forward in our general kind of moral development that animals are not subjected to torture in the way they were just a few years ago. Now constraints on torture, what we call experiment torture of at least animals that are closer to us, like primates, than there were 30 or 40 years ago. But I don't think anyone thinks that animals have the rights and responsibilities of human beings.
What Noam Chomsky has had to say about vegetarianism, veganism, and animal rights has remained remarkably consistent for many years. If you check around Google for a few minutes, you can find different videos recorded at different periods of time of him saying almost exactly the same thing verbatim.
In an interview from 2010, you acknowledged that there exists a moral case for vegetarianism, but at a recent talk at University College London, you claimed that animals cannot have the same rights as humans because, lacking reason, they cannot be considered to have responsibilities.
With regard to rights and responsibilities, they do relate.
He presents a very simple narrative about the nature of rights themselves, claiming that rights are based on responsibilities, and then proceeds to offer a sort of anecdotal claim that the rights of animals have improved dramatically since about 40 years ago, because vivisection was much worse in the United States in the 1950s than it is today. He often adds vague disclaimers about the fact that he thinks that vivisection and testing on animals is bad, that the question of torturing animals or not is worth asking, and he also often vaguely states that he avoids eating meat, although he is not vegetarian or vegan. So naturally, the point of this video is to tell you that Noam Chomsky is completely right. How could anyone possibly disagree with him?
There's an opportunity cost to vegetarianism. Like personally, I'm not a vegetarian, but the main although I almost never eat meat, but the reason is just I don't have the time for it. I don't have the time to think about it. I don't want to think about it. I just pick up whatever saves me time.
You know, it's funny. He's normally being interviewed by people who basically worship him. And yet, the people doing the interviews and the people standing in the background and so on, when he's talking about animal rights, they often kind of look at him like, you can just tell nobody really finds this narrative convincing or adequate. The factual side that I'm not really going to talk about here is that anyone is a 5-minute Google search away from challenging the rather vague claims that Chomsky makes about tremendous progress in vivisection, in laws restricting animal testing. But above all else, apart from the details, I mean, depending on where you're living, you can very quickly Google and see that, you know, the indifferent and ineffective state of laws restricting vivisection in animals, it is what it is. But of all the schools of thought whom you might expect to be skeptical of, probing of such claims, that the government can just write a law, wave its magic wand, and solve the problem, of all the schools of political theory that would challenge that expectation, anarchism would be one of them. And the bizarre thing about Chomsky is that he continues to identify as an anarchist, but there is absolutely nothing sincerely anarchistic in his approach to these facts. Now, I just pause to clarify here. Despite the appearance of my desk and this t-shirt, I'm not an anarchist. You don't even want to know what these books are about, man. I have fewer books than usual on my desk right now because I just finished an essay. But I have more books than usual on the floor. It's a good sign. The concept that rights rest on responsibilities, that they are reciprocal with, that they depend upon responsibilities, that's a popular notion in many schools of political science. Not all. It's by no means universal or default or unchallenged. But among the prominent, well-known schools that completely rejects that line of thought is anarchism, pure and simple. I wonder why there aren't sort of more anarchists outraged at Chomsky for doing such a bad job of representing them. The belief that the federal government of the United States or any of the governments in Europe could resolve such an ethically loaded question as what happens to animals that are the property of scientific laboratories. What happens to animals that fall into the tender mercies of research universities that claim to be curing cancer, claim to be promoting the progress of science, and use that as a justification to torture monkeys to death, lab rats, and what have you? How really would it be possible to convince an anarchist, if they were a sincere anarchist, that government regulation, that government legislation from the top down would solve this problem? I'm not an anarchist. I mentioned in an earlier video that I think of anarchism as a set of theories that can answer some questions, not others, that can be a useful mode of analysis or inquiry in some circumstances and not others. Anarchists are very good at complaining when government regulation fails to solve a problem, and not so good at actually coming up with constructive solutions for, say, raising the level of human rights for workers in garment factories. The first recourse people normally reach for is legislation to allow workers to unionize, but also legislation to actually send a government inspector to visit the factory to make sure that people have access to bathrooms and drinking water. You can tell I used to live in the tropics, that people are not literally chained to their desks. Government regulation is the first resort, and a pure anarchist might say, well, just allow the workers in the factory to carry guns on their job every day and let them sort it out. That's an extremely unpopular political philosophy in the 21st century for some reason. It doesn't seem to convince many people. Another approach to rights that is not based on the notion of rights being reciprocal responsibilities is actually the idea that rights, like any other form of legislation, are based on avoiding harm. This may sound strange and familiar to you. If you stick with me for a minute, you'll learn just how common it is actually as an approach to rights and legislation. Chomsky's theory that all rights have to derive from or correlate to responsibilities supposedly invalidates the concept of animal rights because animals do not have responsibilities. Animals are not responsible under the law. A wolf has no obligation to treat you with kindness. Therefore, you have no obligation to treat the wolf with kindness. That idea can be found in Latin, written by Spinoza, among other thinkers, and it may be from Spinoza that Chomsky himself gets the idea. Spinoza is a philosopher. In case you didn't know from my disparaging tone of voice when I mentioned his name. Reducing harm is a different paradigm for why laws exist, for why rights exist. And we don't create these paradigms just to declare that human rights are the most wonderful thing in the world. The purpose of a rights-based approach in political science is ultimately to describe reality, to analyze reality, and to come up with policy recommendations for how we can improve reality. So, under the harm-based paradigm, we then look at something like, do you have the right to own a gun? Well, in some parts of the United States, you have the almost unlimited right to own a machine gun. In Canada, you don't. What is the justification in either sense? In both places, it's in terms of harm. How do you reduce harm? But do I have the right to buy and use cocaine or heroin? Both sides of that argument, the people who argue that heroin should be illegal and the people who argue that heroin should be decriminalized or made legal, both sides pose their arguments in terms of harm reduction. What will do the least harm to society? What will allow individuals to help themselves, etc. So actually the notion that we establish rights, like any other set of legal principles, in order to reduce harm, as a description of reality, as analysis of how the world works, it makes a lot of sense. In terms of the Western parliamentary tradition, that in Canada is mostly derived from England, a few other sources of influence, all of these approaches, traditional jurisprudence, they work just okay when we're talking about wild animals, because the principal issue is harm. It's pretty easy for the Western parliamentary system to legislate and regulate the interactions of human beings with bears and lions. Do you have the right to own a lion? As late as the 1960s in England, private citizens could buy lions and tigers and other dangerous cats and put them in the backyard of their houses. There was no legislation preventing that. And because of the British Empire, a few people did. It wasn't common. Over time, accidents happen, new laws get passed. But very obviously, the reasons why people are not allowed to own lions and bears, etc., has to do with harm and preventing harm. So our legal paradigms work okay in those circumstances. Laws that prevent you from going into a piece of land that's specially reserved as a wilderness preservation area for bears, laws that prevent you from hunting bears, etc., those are pretty straightforward. Those work okay. The problem has been that this harm-based paradigm, the basic assumptions of harm reduction, were not applied to and were difficult even to conceptualize in relation to meat production and owning animals in order to exploit them. How do we reduce harm? Now, the paradox for non-vegans is that a harm reduction approach does not make sense if you're killing and eating animals at all. For vegans, things are much simpler. For vegans, we would still need those laws that govern bears and tigers in the wild. We still need laws for wilderness preservation and for what to do if a bear actually climbs over your fence and is in your backyard. I live in Canada. That does actually happen here. Who's going to fire the tranquilizer dart and who's going to pay for a truck to carry the bear away and put it back in the wilderness or what have you? These are real questions we have to deal with. These are also animal rights questions. But the whole paradigm of modern Western jurisprudence breaks down and makes no sense at all when you're talking about, this is a real example, monkeys captured in the jungle along the border between Vietnam and Cambodia, put on an airplane, taken to England, locked into a laboratory, and then tortured until they die. How do you reduce the harm in that situation? Now, the legal questions surrounding that practice were ultimately raised by airlines because the airplanes that were being given the task of transporting these monkeys found it repugnant. And then once the airlines started kicking up a fuss, then some people in the press started kicking up a fuss. British Parliament sent a committee of inquiry, sent some people to go and visit the Vietnam-Cambodia border where these monkeys were being captured. And bizarrely, what they decided, again, for the reasons I've been outlining here, was that the legal change that had to happen was that it was no longer acceptable to torture monkeys to death in laboratories if they were born in the wild. Because then wild monkeys fell under this category of habitat conservation, of wilderness preservation. However, if the monkeys were born in a cage, then they could be purchased as property and tortured to death with impunity, etc. The question of, in praxis, how universities actually regulate torturing animals to death, usually, I'm here generalizing about the whole Western world, comes down to a committee system, which is, the worst kind of parody of democracy. So within the university, they ask around some of the professors, say, hey, who's willing to sit on the animal rights committee? They may not call it that. They may call it the research protocol committee or the ethics committee for animal research or what have you. Keep it vague. The ethics committee, that'll do. And whatever, 6 different professors get to put on their resume that they spent a couple hours here and there sitting on an ethics committee, and pieces of paper are shown to them to either approve or not approve. And I do not know of any example anywhere in the world where this results in rigorous evaluation of what is and what is not necessary animal suffering. I don't know of any example in the world where this works to actually reduce harm to animals. And one round of court cases and legal decisions in Europe and so on after another, they just have to confess this system doesn't work. The Labour government in England many years ago set up a special committee, not at the university level, but at the government level, that was supposed to review all applications for vivisection, for torturing animals to death. And a few years later, people evaluated, and what do you know? It actually exists to promote vivisection. There's no evaluation of what's necessary or unnecessary, what have you. It does not work in the sense that it was invented to work. Now, so look, what Noam Chomsky has to say on this subject is, in a word, stupid and ignorant and self-righteous. That's about 4 words there, not including and. And as I say, when you actually watch the videos, I don't think anyone in the room with him when he's saying this stuff finds it convincing or impressive. Nobody even has the feeling that this guy has looked into it, has done a couple Google searches to figure out how animal rights and vivisection have changed over the last bunch of years. But this is interesting because Chomsky is allegedly an anarchist. And this is actually an example of a subject where the whole tradition, the 1,000-year-long tradition of British law and parliamentary decision-making, legal norms, rights-based rules, where they break down and become meaningless. So if there's one school of thought that really should be able to tear into this issue and have something meaningful to say, it's exactly the school of thought that Noam Chomsky claims he represents: anarchism.